It was just another busy morning at the airport. The hum of travelers rushing from one gate to another, the beeping of security scanners, and the chatter of families and business people alike filled the air. Among the crowd, one woman stood out. She was dressed in a sleek, well-tailored suit, a confident, calm expression on her face as she walked through the terminal. To anyone who looked at her, she was just another traveler on her way to a business meeting. What they didn't know, however, was that she was the CEO of one of the most successful companies in the country. She'd traveled many times before, her professional life revolving around meetings with clients, business partners, and investors. Traveling was second nature to her, and she knew the routine. Check-in, security, boarding, it was all part of the game. But today something would happen that would change everything. As she approached the security checkpoint, she scanned her boarding pass and stepped into the line with other passengers. The security officers were going through the usual motions, telling people to remove their shoes, belts, and anything in their pockets. She did as she always did, removed her jacket, took off her shoes, and placed her items into the bins on the conveyor belt. Nothing unusual. She was used to the routine, and so were the officers. They didn't pay her any extra attention. She wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. But then, just as she was about to walk through the metal detector, one of the security officers suddenly raised his hand and stopped her. He looked at the screen and then back at her, a puzzled expression on his face. She had seen that look before. It was the look of someone who wasn't quite sure if something was right, but didn't want to admit it. The officer motioned for her to step aside, and she complied, thinking it was just another random check. "Ma'am, we need to do a secondary search," the officer said, his tone flat. The CEO raised an eyebrow but nodded. She was used to this, especially when traveling to large international airports. Random checks were part of the security protocols. No big deal. But as the officer patted her down, she felt a growing sense of unease. He seemed to be taking longer than usual, his movements stiff and uncomfortable. She glanced around, noticing the other passengers were starting to stare. She felt a sinking feeling in her stomach. When the officer finished, he didn't immediately let her go. Instead, he motioned for another officer to come over. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us for further questioning," he said, more forcefully now. She tried to stay calm, her mind racing. "Is there a problem? I've been through security countless times before." "What's this about?" she asked, her voice steady but tinged with confusion. The officer didn't answer right away. He just looked at her, and for a moment she thought she saw something. Fear, maybe? It was hard to say. Then, without saying a word, he turned and led her toward a nearby holding area. The atmosphere around her seemed to change. People who had been minding their own business started to turn their heads and stare. She could feel their eyes on her, and it made her uncomfortable. The CEO had spent years building a reputation, not just as a business leader, but as a role model for many. She knew what it felt like to be respected and admired, but at this moment she felt small, like she was being judged without reason. They reached a small room at the back of the security area. The officer stepped inside with her, followed by a second officer. She felt her pulse quicken. The room was stark, with cold white walls and a single metal chair in the center. There was no place to sit except for the chair they'd motioned her toward. It didn't feel like a place for questioning. It felt like a place for detaining someone. "Please take a seat," the officer said, still avoiding eye contact. The CEO hesitated for a moment before sitting down. She felt the weight of the situation slowly sinking in. What was going on? Why had she been stopped? Was this just a simple misunderstanding, or was there something more to it? She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears as she tried to remain calm. She pulled out her phone to call her assistant, but before she could dial, the officer spoke again. "We need to verify your identification," he said. "Please stay seated." She looked up, confused. "My identification? I already showed you my boarding pass and ID." The officer's face remained expressionless. "We need to make sure everything checks out." "Just a precaution." The CEO stared at him, trying to make sense of the situation. She knew this wasn't the usual procedure. She had traveled enough to know that things like this didn't just happen. She wasn't sure what to think. Was she being targeted? Or was this some sort of mix-up? She began to feel the weight of her status, her business, her career, everything she had worked for. Could it all be undermined in a moment? As the minutes passed, the tension in the room grew. Her mind raced, but she didn't show it. She knew she had to keep her composure, at least on the outside. Her company's future was on the line, and if this situation didn't resolve soon, it could have serious consequences. She glanced at the officer again, who was still standing there looking at the screen in front of him. He wasn't speaking. He wasn't even acknowledging her presence. The silence in the room was deafening. She wanted to speak up to ask him what was going on, but something told her that doing so would only make things worse. Then, she heard footsteps outside the room. Her assistant had arrived. She stood up quickly, feeling a brief surge of hope. But when the door opened, she was faced with another officer. The man was much taller, with an air of authority about him. He stepped into the room and the door clicked shut behind him. "We're going to need you to stay here a little longer, ma'am," the new officer said, his tone cold and formal. "What is going on? Why am I being detained like this?" the CEO asked, her voice rising with frustration. The officer didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled out a clipboard and began scribbling something down. He looked at her, then back at the paper. It was as if she wasn't even there. The minutes seemed to drag on forever. Her assistant, standing just outside the door, tried to speak to someone, but the officers refused to engage. It was clear that she was being treated like a criminal, without any reason or explanation. The CEO felt the sting of humiliation. She had dealt with corporate challenges, boardroom politics, and demanding investors. But this was different. This was an entirely new kind of challenge, one she had never been prepared for. She glanced at her watch. She had been there for what felt like hours, though it had only been a matter of minutes. As time passed, her sense of unease grew. What was going to happen next? Would she be able to make her flight? Would she be allowed to go on with her business trip? Or was her reputation already under attack? She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She couldn't lose focus. Not now. She had to remain calm. She had to keep her head together if she was going to get through this. Finally, the door opened again. The officer stepped in, but this time he wasn't alone. A senior security officer followed behind him. The man's uniform was different, his expression more serious. The CEO felt her stomach drop. This wasn't going the way she thought it would. The senior officer looked directly at her. "I need you to come with me." Her heart pounded in her chest. Was this the moment when everything would change? The CEO stood frozen for a moment, her mind racing. She had been in many difficult situations before, but none like this. This wasn't a business negotiation or a tough boardroom discussion. This was real. She was being detained in an airport, her every move scrutinized by officers who hadn't yet told her why she was there. It was a feeling of powerlessness that she wasn't used to. Her heart beat faster as the senior officer motioned for her to follow. "Come with me," the officer repeated, his tone firm but not unkind. The CEO had no choice but to obey. As she stood up from the uncomfortable chair, her mind was still racing. She needed answers. Why had they stopped her? Why had she been treated this way? The questions buzzed in her mind, but for now, all she could do was follow the officer down the narrow corridor. She didn't look back at the holding room, but she could feel the stares of the other passengers in the terminal. She could sense the whispers, the judgment that had already begun. The humiliation felt like a heavy weight on her shoulders, and with each step it grew heavier. She had always carried herself with confidence, but now, in this moment, she felt small. All she wanted was to get through security and go on with her day. But now she was trapped in a situation she hadn't seen coming. As they walked down the hallway, she couldn't help but notice how sterile everything seemed. The walls were a dull white. The fluorescent lights above flickered occasionally, and the air felt colder than usual. There was a sense of finality in the way the officer moved, like he was guiding her toward something she didn't want to face. She tried to keep her composure, but her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. Her assistant, still standing outside the holding area, had tried to approach one of the officers earlier. She had waved her hand, trying to get the attention of anyone who could help. But the officers had been unyielding, their faces unreadable. The CEO couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that she was being treated differently from anyone else. The senior officer finally led her to a small office near the security checkpoint. It was dimly lit, with a desk in the center and a couple of chairs in front. He gestured for her to sit down, and she did so reluctantly, still trying to maintain her calm. "Please wait here for a moment," the officer said. He left the room quickly, closing the door behind him. The room felt oppressive. The silence was deafening and the weight of the situation began to settle in. She looked around the office, trying to distract herself. There were papers on the desk. Just ordinary airport forms, nothing out of the ordinary. But to her, they felt like a reminder of how out of place she was. She wasn't supposed to be here. She was supposed to be on a plane, heading to an important meeting. Instead, she was sitting in a small, sterile room, unsure of what was coming next. Her mind wandered back to the security checkpoint. She had done everything by the book. She had complied with every request, removed her jacket, emptied her pockets, and placed her items in the bin. She had followed every rule, and yet here she was, being detained like a criminal. Was it a random mistake? Or was there something more to it? She couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in her gut that this wasn't just about a simple security check. The way they had treated her, how they hadn't even bothered to explain what was going on, felt wrong. She wasn't just another traveler. She wasn't just a faceless person going through security. She was a CEO, a leader in her field, and she had never experienced anything like this before. The door opened suddenly, breaking her thoughts. The senior officer returned, but this time he wasn't alone. Another officer entered the room carrying a tablet in his hand. He didn't speak immediately, but instead he looked at the screen of the tablet, his fingers tapping the screen as he scrolled through something. The first officer, who had led her down the hall, stood silently by the door. The CEO couldn't help but wonder what they were looking at. Was it her personal information? Her flight details? Or was it something else? The uncertainty was unbearable. She tried to stay calm, but the silence in the room only made the situation feel more tense. After what felt like an eternity, the officer with the tablet finally looked up. "We've been reviewing your information," he said, his voice cold and impersonal. "There seems to have been a mix-up. A system error caused your identification to flag in our security system." The CEO felt a flicker of relief. It was just a mistake, a glitch in the system. But at the same time, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than they were letting on. "Are you saying this was all just a misunderstanding?" she asked, her voice steady but still tinged with frustration. The officer nodded, but his expression remained unchanged. "Yes, but we still need to verify some details. It's part of our protocol." She wanted to argue, to demand to be let go, but she stopped herself. This wasn't the time for confrontation. She had been through enough tough negotiations in her career to know when to push and when to wait. Right now, she needed to stay calm and wait for them to clear this up. She was in no position to make demands, not yet. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized how much this could damage her reputation. She had spent years building her career, making her company one of the most respected in the industry. This incident could undermine everything she had worked for. What if it made the news? What if people started questioning her integrity? What if they started to think she was a criminal, or worse, that she was involved in something shady? The thought was almost unbearable. She had worked so hard to earn her place, to prove that she was capable of leading a successful company. Now, in the span of just a few minutes, everything could come crashing down. "Ma'am, we just need to verify a few more things and you'll be on your way," the senior officer said, breaking her thoughts. "We apologize for the inconvenience." She forced herself to nod. "How much longer will this take?" she asked, her voice still calm but tinged with impatience. "We'll be as quick as we can," the officer replied, though his tone gave no indication that the process would be anything but slow. The CEO sat back in her chair, trying to control the rising sense of panic inside her. She had always prided herself on being composed, on being the one who remained level-headed in any situation. But this was different. This was out of her control, and that scared her more than anything. Minutes turned into what felt like hours. The officers continued to review their information, their eyes focused on the tablet in front of them. They didn't speak to her again. The silence was deafening, and every second that passed felt like a small eternity. She thought about her assistant, who was still waiting outside. She had to be getting worried by now. How long had it been? How long had she been sitting in this sterile room, waiting for an explanation that seemed to never come? It felt like a dream, a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Finally, after what felt like an endless period of waiting, the door opened once more. The senior officer stepped inside, followed by another officer, this one looking more serious than the others. "We've confirmed everything," the officer said, his voice stiff. "You're free to go. We apologize for the inconvenience." The CEO stood up, not sure whether she should feel relieved or angry. "That's it?" she asked, unable to hide the frustration in her voice. The officer nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Everything checks out. We're sorry for the delay." She didn't say anything else. She turned toward the door, ready to leave. But as she stepped into the hallway, she realized something. Nothing about this situation was over. Not really. As she stepped out into the hallway, a flood of emotions rushed over her. Relief, frustration, confusion, and even anger all swirled inside her. She had been cleared, she was free to go. But the weight of the experience hadn't left her. It felt like a bad dream, one she couldn't wake up from. She was led back to the main terminal by the senior officer, who now seemed to be trying to make amends with his politeness. "Thank you for your patience, ma'am," he said, his voice softer than before, though still formal. She didn't respond immediately. She simply nodded, her mind still spinning. There were so many things she wanted to say, but what was the point? Arguing wouldn't fix anything. She knew better than that. Her mind was already moving toward the next steps, what to do, how to handle the situation when it went public, and how to protect everything she had worked so hard for. They reached the main part of the airport, where travelers bustled around her, oblivious to the drama that had unfolded just moments before. The noise of the crowd seemed distant to her, as if she were in a different world. For a moment she just stood there, watching the flow of people. Everything felt surreal. The senior officer gave her a small bow of his head as he turned to leave, but she didn't watch him go. Her eyes were fixed ahead, scanning the terminal for her assistant. She spotted her standing by the coffee shop, phone pressed to her ear, speaking urgently to someone. Her assistant's face brightened when she saw the CEO, and she quickly ended the call and rushed over to her. "Are you okay?" her assistant asked, her voice laced with concern. The CEO could see the worry in her assistant's eyes. She hadn't been able to explain what had happened while she was detained. She hadn't wanted to cause alarm until she knew what was going on. But now, standing here, it was all real. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice didn't quite carry the calm confidence it usually did. It was a misunderstanding. But it was handled terribly. Her assistant raised an eyebrow. "A misunderstanding?" she repeated, clearly skeptical. "Apparently," the CEO replied, "they had some sort of system error that flagged my ID. They didn't even explain it clearly. I was just thrown in a holding room without any answers." It was humiliating. Her assistant let out a sharp breath. "I can't believe this. I tried to get someone to help you, but they wouldn't listen to me. I was getting worried." "What happened?" The CEO sighed deeply. "It doesn't matter now. I've been cleared." "I'm fine, but—" she hesitated. "This isn't over." "Not by a long shot." Her assistant's face tightened. "What do you mean?" The CEO looked around the terminal, her thoughts racing. She had been cleared, yes, but the situation felt far from resolved. The public would find out soon. It was inevitable. News traveled fast in the digital age, and stories like hers didn't stay quiet for long. It would be all over the headlines by the end of the day. There was no avoiding the fallout. She could already imagine the headlines. "CEO detained in airport mistake," or "high-profile business leader arrested by security." The thought made her stomach twist. It wasn't just the humiliation. It was the potential damage to her company's reputation. Everything she had worked for, everything she had built, could be called into question because of a single mistake. "I don't want anyone to think that this is just a small issue," she said finally, looking at her assistant with determination. "This is bigger than just me. This could affect my company, the people who trust me, and the work we've done." Her assistant nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "So what's the plan?" The CEO exhaled slowly, steeling herself. "First, I need to make sure that this doesn't get out of control. I'll talk to the board when I get back. I need them on my side. Then we'll issue a statement, something that makes it clear this was a mistake and we won't stand for it. But we have to be careful with how we handle this. If we react too harshly, it'll just add fuel to the fire." Her assistant's expression softened. "I'll help you with the statement. But I think we need to get ahead of this. If this goes public, we'll need a clear plan." The CEO agreed. "You're right. I don't want to wait for this to blow up. We need to control the narrative." The next few hours passed in a blur. The CEO made her way to the business lounge to catch a flight, her mind focused on the steps ahead. But even as she walked through the airport, she could feel the eyes on her. People were whispering, pointing. Her phone buzzed constantly with calls and messages, some from people she knew, others from media outlets trying to get a statement. She ignored most of them, knowing that speaking too soon could backfire. When she boarded the plane, her assistant was by her side, still working on their response. The CEO glanced out of the window, trying to push aside the anxiety that had built up in her chest. The flight took off, and as the plane climbed into the sky, she finally allowed herself to breathe a little easier. The immediate threat had passed, but she knew the storm wasn't over. After the flight, they went straight to her office. The CEO spent hours drafting a statement with her PR team. It was crucial that they got it right. They needed to convey both the severity of the situation and the confidence that this was a mistake, nothing more. The message needed to be firm but measured. The CEO didn't want to appear weak or defensive. She needed to come across as someone who had been wronged, but who was still in control. By the time the statement was finalized, the media had already picked up on the story. Her phone was blowing up with notifications, but this time, they were from the press. They were all looking for her comment on the incident. It was no longer about what had happened at the airport. It was about the larger implications of the story. People were asking if the treatment of the CEO was an isolated incident or a reflection of something deeper. The story was quickly turning into something about racial profiling, about unfair treatment of business leaders, especially women of color. As the story began to unfold, the CEO's PR team quickly organized a press conference to respond to the situation. She wasn't sure she was ready to face the world just yet, but she knew she had to. She had to take control of the narrative before it spun out of control. The next day, standing in front of a room full of reporters, the CEO kept her posture straight and her expression neutral. She spoke about the injustice she had faced, how her treatment was not just wrong, it was unprofessional and unnecessary. But she also made it clear that she wasn't just a victim of circumstance. She was strong, capable, and focused on the future. The press conference lasted only 20 minutes, but it was enough. The media would continue to report on the incident for days, but the CEO knew that as long as she kept her head high, she would come out of this stronger than before. The situation wasn't ideal, but it wasn't the end of her career either. She had the resilience to weather the storm. By the end of the day, the story was no longer just about her. It had become about a larger issue, about how people of color were treated in spaces that were supposed to be safe. The CEO had turned her humiliation into a platform for change. She wasn't going to let this moment define her, but she was going to make sure it would lead to something better. The days that followed were a blur. The CEO felt as though her life had been put under a microscope, with the media analyzing every part of her experience at the airport. News outlets, social media, and even her own colleagues were all discussing the incident. It had turned into a national conversation, with people debating everything from the way she was treated to the broader issue of racial profiling in public spaces. It was overwhelming, but there was no way to ignore it. Her phone was constantly buzzing with calls and messages. Some were from well-wishers, others from journalists wanting an exclusive. But it wasn't just the media that was reaching out. People who had once been distant colleagues were now offering support, expressing their solidarity and sharing stories of similar experiences. It was becoming clear to her that this wasn't just about her, it was about something much bigger. For the first time in her career, she was at the center of a social movement. The incident had sparked conversations about racial injustice, about how people of color were treated in spaces where they should have been safe. As the CEO of a major company, she had always been aware of the power dynamics at play, but now she was living them. The pressure to navigate this new reality was immense, but she had no choice but to push through. She spent hours each day meeting with her legal team, PR experts, and advisors to figure out the best way to respond. The initial statement had been successful. It had been firm, direct, and calm, but now she needed to ensure that the story didn't spiral out of control. She couldn't afford to appear reactive. She had to be proactive, shaping the narrative in a way that would be beneficial for her, her company, and the larger conversation. One of the first things she did was reach out to her board of directors. They had been supportive, but she knew the situation could have long-term consequences. The conversation was tense at first. The board members were concerned, asking if this would impact their business or stock price. She reassured them that she was in control, and that the company's focus would remain on its long-term goals, despite the current media attention. But the truth was, it wasn't just about business anymore. She knew this would impact the way she was perceived in the corporate world. She had always prided herself on being a leader who could handle any challenge. But this was a new kind of test. It was one thing to lead a company through market fluctuations or economic downturns. It was another to lead when the entire world was watching your every move. The next few days were spent crafting a series of responses to the media. She didn't want to be seen as someone who was trying to capitalize on the situation. But she also knew this was an opportunity to make a larger impact. She had to strike a balance between defending herself and addressing the systemic issues that had led to her treatment. She wasn't just a CEO anymore. She was a symbol of something much more important. It wasn't easy. She was often exhausted, emotionally drained from the constant back and forth with the media, her legal team, and her company. Every day brought new questions, new angles, new criticisms. But through it all, she remained focused. She refused to let the situation define her. She had been wronged, yes, but she wouldn't let it break her. Then came the moment she had been preparing for. A major national news outlet asked for an exclusive interview. They wanted her to tell her story in her own words, to explain what had happened at the airport and what it meant for the larger conversation about racial injustice. It was a huge opportunity, but it was also a risk. She knew that no matter how carefully she prepared, the interview could be twisted or misinterpreted. She had to be careful. She agreed to the interview and the team began to prepare. The questions were tough, the answers even tougher. She needed to speak from the heart, but she also had to be measured. She had to find a way to address the personal impact of what had happened without getting lost in emotion. She had to show that she was strong, that she was more than just the sum of this experience. She needed to demonstrate that this wasn't a setback, it was a stepping stone. The day of the interview, she sat in front of the camera, calm and composed. The interviewer asked her about her experience at the airport, and for the first time she told her story in full. She described how she had been detained without explanation, how the officers had treated her like a criminal without any justification. She spoke about the confusion, the humiliation, and the fear she felt as she was taken away in handcuffs. But she also spoke about the bigger picture. She addressed the systemic issues that had allowed something like this to happen in the first place. She talked about the reality that people of color often face when navigating public spaces, how they are unfairly treated and subjected to scrutiny based on nothing more than their appearance. She didn't hold back. This was no longer just about her. It was about every person who had ever been unfairly targeted. The interview was raw, honest, and powerful. It wasn't just her telling a story, it was her calling for change. She didn't pretend to have all the answers, but she knew that this moment was an opportunity to use her voice for something bigger than herself. She had been given a platform, and she was determined to make the most of it. As the interview aired, the response was overwhelming. People from all walks of life reached out to express their support. Messages poured in from activists, business leaders, and ordinary people who had been inspired by her courage. It was clear that her words had struck a chord. The media coverage exploded. "Here's done." Hers became a symbol of the fight for justice, for fairness, and for equality. But the story didn't end there. As the public conversation grew, the pressure on the airport to respond increased. People began calling for accountability, demanding that the officers involved be held responsible for their actions. Protests were organized outside the airport and petitions began circulating online. The airport's management issued a public apology, but it wasn't enough to quiet the outrage. Many felt that the apology was too little, too late. The CEO, meanwhile, stayed focused on her mission. She continued to speak out about the need for change in public spaces, advocating for better training and more oversight in security procedures. She worked with organizations that were focused on racial justice, using her platform to push for policies that would ensure that no one else had to experience what she had gone through. Throughout it all, she kept her eyes on the bigger picture. The incident had been painful, and the process of dealing with the fallout had been exhausting. But she had used it as an opportunity to fight for something larger than herself. She had used her platform to start a conversation about the systemic issues that affected so many people, and she wasn't about to stop now. As the weeks passed, the media focus on the incident slowly began to fade. But for the CEO, the work was far from over. She had begun a journey that was bigger than any one company or any one individual. It was a journey toward justice, toward change, and toward a world where no one would have to face the kind of treatment she had endured. The CEO had become not just a business leader, but a beacon of hope and a symbol of the fight for equality, and she was determined to see that fight through no matter how long it took. The aftermath of the airport incident had changed everything. For weeks, the CEO felt like she was in the middle of a whirlwind. The media coverage, the public response, and the pressure to maintain control of her image, it was overwhelming. But she was no longer just a CEO managing a company. She was now an advocate for change, a voice in a much larger conversation. The weight of it all was heavy, but she had chosen this path and there was no turning back. The media attention, while intense at first, had started to settle down. The story was still alive, but the initial shock had faded. People were still talking about her experience, but now the conversation was shifting from shock and outrage to real solutions. There were more discussions about what could be done to prevent incidents like hers from happening again. It was no longer just about the mistake at the airport. It was about how systems could be changed to better treat everyone, regardless of their race or background. One morning, as she sat in her office reflecting on everything that had happened, her phone buzzed with a new message. It was from a former colleague, someone she hadn't spoken to in years. The message simply said, "I've been watching the news. Your words have made a difference. Thank you for speaking up." The message brought a smile to her face. It was one of many messages she had received over the past few weeks. People were reaching out from all corners of the world. Some were strangers, others were people she had worked with or known briefly. It was clear that her story had resonated with many, and it felt like a validation of everything she had done. But she wasn't done yet. There was more work to do, more conversations to be had, and more changes to fight for. She decided to visit the airport where it all started, not to confront anyone, but to see for herself what had changed. When she arrived, she was greeted by a senior manager who had been involved in the response to the incident. He looked nervous, but he greeted her warmly. "We've taken some steps to improve things here," he said, leading her through the security area. "We've revamped our training programs. We've brought in experts to educate our staff about racial profiling and unconscious bias. It's not enough, but it's a start." The CEO nodded, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and frustration. The changes were a step in the right direction, but she knew that real change would take time. The system was vast, and the road ahead would be long. Still, she appreciated the effort. She had been a catalyst for change, and that meant something. But this was just the beginning. As she walked through the airport, she couldn't help but notice the small signs of progress. There were new posters up, promoting diversity and inclusion in the workplace. Security staff were talking to each other in a way that felt more open and cooperative. The CEO realized that the airport was taking her story seriously, and that made her feel like the work she was doing was worthwhile. Over the next few weeks, she continued to use her platform to speak about racial justice and fairness in public spaces. She worked closely with several organizations that were dedicated to fighting discrimination, and she became involved in initiatives that aimed to address systemic issues in various industries. It was clear that she had gained a voice that people were listening to, and she wasn't about to waste it. Her company, too, had benefited from her advocacy. It wasn't just about the public relations boost, though that was certainly a part of it. The CEO's outspokenness had inspired her employees, many of whom had felt powerless in the face of similar challenges. They saw their leader standing up for what was right, and it made them feel like they could do the same in their own lives. The culture within the company had shifted. It was no longer just about profits and numbers. It was about creating a space where people felt valued, heard and respected. The board of directors, initially concerned about the potential fallout from the incident, were now fully behind her. They recognized the power of her leadership and the impact she was having on the larger conversation. Her focus on diversity and inclusion had become a core part of the company's mission, and it was paying off. The company's reputation was stronger than ever, and employees were more engaged than they had been in years. But even as she saw the positive changes in her company, the CEO knew that her work wasn't finished. The incidents of racial profiling and discrimination were still happening every day, all over the world. The fight for equality was far from over, and though she had made a difference, She was determined to do more. She began speaking at conferences, sharing her story, and encouraging others to use their voices for change. She spoke about the importance of representation in leadership positions, of creating systems that empowered people of all backgrounds to thrive. She talked about the need for accountability in every industry, and the necessity of having difficult conversations about race and privilege. These were conversations that many people had been avoiding for years, but the CEO knew they were necessary. As she traveled to speak at various events, she met other leaders who shared her passion for change. Some were CEOs of other major companies, while others were activists, educators, or community leaders. What they all had in common was the understanding that real progress required collective effort. It wasn't enough to just speak out on social media or issue a statement once a year. True change came from sustained effort, from building alliances and working together to dismantle the systems of oppression that had been in place for so long. One afternoon, she received a call from a prominent activist who had been following her journey. "You've started something important," the activist said, "but I believe you're just getting started. There's so much more work to do." The CEO felt a surge of determination. The road ahead was long, but she knew she had the strength to keep going. She had already made a difference, but there was still so much to be done. She wasn't going to stop now. She had learned through this experience that one person, one story, could create ripples that led to a wave of change. As she looked back on everything that had happened, the humiliating experience at the airport, the media storm, the long days of planning and strategizing, she realized that this had been a turning point in her life. It had been a painful chapter, but it had also been a transformative one. It had forced her to confront not just the challenges in the world, but the challenges within herself. She had learned that being a leader wasn't just about making decisions for a company. It was about making decisions for the world, for the future, and for the people who looked to her for guidance. The CEO had found her voice in a way she never had before. She had become not just a business leader, but an advocate for justice, for equality, and for the rights of those who had been silenced for too long. And as she continued her journey, she knew that her story, her voice would be a beacon for those who needed it most.